Hey everybody, I'm Raj Kumar, President Editor-in-Chief of DevX, back again for my series of conversations with leaders during this pandemic crisis, and really excited to have Richard Hatchett with me today. Thanks, Richard, for agreeing to take some time to do this.
No, it's a pleasure, Raj. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, let me just say a word about you, because people may not know you as well. You know, the organization you run, you're the CEO of CEPI, which is right at the center of the race to find a vaccine, to develop a vaccine against COVID-19. And you are very engaged in a lot of what are front page stories right now about this vaccine development. CEPI started back in 2017. You joined soon after it started. I was there at the founding of it. It happened in Davos, a little bit of a flashy, splashy event. It came out of the Ebola situation where there was a sense of frustration that, hey, how come we couldn't move faster to develop a vaccine against Ebola? We need new platforms. We need a new, broader coalition to just move. And now, of course, although CEPI was started to work on several other diseases, with this crisis, with this pandemic, you have completely pivoted. You're ramping up. You're moving fast in this direction. So it's just great to get some time with you today, Richard, to hear how things are going. I know lots of people in our community are interested and eager to hear. And those of you who are following us live on all different platforms, please throw in your questions if you have, and we'll try to weave them into the discussion. For those who don't know your backstory, you are a trained emergency room physician oncologist. You have a long career in medicine. You ran the triage unit outside of the Ground Zero during September 11th. You helped to set up the U.S. Medical Reserve Corps. You worked at BARDA, where you're chief medical officer and deputy director before you jumped over to this new initiative at CEPI. And now I'm guessing you're on the phone every day with the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, the biggest biotechs, with all kinds of funders, donors, trying to figure out how do we more quickly develop and test and manufacture and scale and ultimately deliver a vaccine against this pandemic.
That's a pretty good summary. We jumped into this immediately in early January. We had actually been gearing up as an organization. You know, we're 3 years old, as you said. We've been gearing up over that time, trying to shorten our cycle times in terms of putting projects in place and getting them up and running. We had developed an internal emergency operations procedure, and actually, when the announcement from China about an unusual respiratory illness was issued at the end of December, we elevated our alert posture according to this new emergency operations procedures that we had just worked out, and obviously we're tracking things very closely. Pretty quickly, the way we had been thinking about responding to new emerging diseases, I mean, disease X, which is what WHO has called, the unknown emerging disease, has been part of our mission space, and we had made investments, and we can talk about that if that's of interest, even before COVID-19. But the way we had been thinking about responding to a disease X, obviously, when a disease first comes out, you don't know much about it. You don't know how transmissible it is. You don't know how great the threat is, and you know very little about the epidemiology. And so you want to take a staged approach to gearing up. And so we very quickly made the decision to actually produce some candidate vaccines, although that didn't mean that we were planning to do full-scale development or certainly full-scale vaccination. But over the course of the first several weeks of January, the situation evolved very rapidly. And by about January 20th, we realized that we were potentially facing, we didn't know how the Chinese response was going to play out, but potentially facing an event that could become a pandemic. And so we made the decision to really go ahead and engage in full-scale development, start clinical development. And we made our first awards on January 23rd, actually at Davos. As it turned out, that week at Davos was a week when sort of everything pivoted and changed. And we made our first awards. And
so just so people understand, when you talk about getting involved in vaccine development, you're basically the funding mechanism that evaluates opportunities and funds other organizations, pharma, universities, biotech to actually develop it. Is that right?
Yeah, no, exactly. So we aggregate funding from countries and from philanthropies, from the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust in particular, and then use that to make investments through public-private partnerships with mainly with private sector partners, but also with a few academic partners, a few nonprofit organizations to support vaccine development. And then in that vaccine development, we we're not just a funding body. We bring a lot of technical expertise. We bring networks, global networks that we've developed over the last several years. And we actually can reach back to our funders, who are countries. I mean, most of them are countries, and have capabilities and institutional resources and scientific expertise that they can bring to bear. So we sort of serve as a lens through which to concentrate the funding, concentrate all that global expertise, towards the goal of developing vaccines. And obviously, when COVID-19 emerged and it quickly became clear how serious a problem it was going to be, we scaled up a brand new vaccine development effort. And currently we've got 9 vaccines that we've supported, 4 of which are in clinical trials at this point.
And 3 of those 4, I think, are in phase 2 or phase 3 even clinical trials, right? I mean, they're advancing at remarkable, like a unprecedented pace, I think, for vaccine development.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually, so as of last week, this is the last time I checked the numbers, there were 11 vaccines that had entered clinical trials. 6 of those were in China. And most of the Chinese vaccines are inactivated vaccines. So these are just the killed virus. Essentially,
which is the traditional approach. The approach has been tried and true for many, many decades now.
Yeah, but tricky, and I mean, it is a tricky approach, but it is tried and true. But of the other 5 vaccines that are in clinical trials, as I said, CEPI's supported 4, and some of them are entering phase 2, even phase 3 trials in the next several weeks. So they are moving at light speed, really, really quickly. The first vaccine into clinical trials, Moderna, went from which is an mRNA-based vaccine, was in clinical trials just 9 weeks after the release of the sequences of the virus, which is extraordinary.
And this is a lot of the reason why CEPI was set up to begin with. I remember when Bill Gates was in Davos talking about this, and he was very excited about this idea of platforms, that we need new vaccine development platforms. And essentially the reason, as I understand, Moderna has been able to move quickly is they had a platform already using these mRNA approaches, which are these kind of genetic, in layman's terms, I guess, these are basically a genetic approach where you're not having to grow a virus. You're kind of doing it very quickly. You can replicate and scale. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just about developing it, but it's about how quickly you can, create doses, manufacture it, and then ultimately get it out.
That's absolutely right. The Moderna story is an interesting story because it was a platform, that basically relies on the ability to synthesize RNA, which we can do very rapidly. And it was supported originally by the U.S. government, by DARPA, by the Gates Foundation, precisely because it had some of these attributes of potential speed. So it was designed to be a rapid response platform. But the other piece that allowed them to move so quickly into clinical trials, and I think this is critically important to understand, is that they were leveraging a lot of work that had been done on another coronavirus, in this case, MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. I think most of the folks listening will be familiar with SARS, probably familiar with MERS. Barney Graham, who is the Deputy Director of the Vaccine Research Center at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, had been working for a couple of years on the MERS pathogen, or MERS virus, and had tried to figure out ways to basically present the protein on the surface of the MERS virus that the immune system responds to in the most effective and efficient way to the immune system. So he had been doing work on that for a long time. When the new virus emerged, it was a coronavirus as well, obviously, has a very similar protein on its surface. Barney was able to take what he had learned from working on MERS, quickly apply it to the new virus, and then present that information to Moderna. And so it was a combination of working on a prototype pathogen and having this rapid response platform that together allowed that rapid response. CEPI, as an organization, MERS was one of the first 3 viruses that we focused on. And I was often asked, why are you investing so much money on a virus that has only over nearly a decade caused about 2,500 cases? And my answer was always, and we'd allocated about $100 million to MERS research. My answer was always, well, we don't know what the future for MERS is going to be. And if you had asked me, in 2012, before the West African Ebola epidemic, why are you investing so much money in Ebola? It would have been exactly the same thing. Small outbreaks. We don't know what the future for each pathogen is going to be, and then
which is exactly why CEPI was created.
Which is
exactly why you exist.
Exactly why CEPI was created. But the other reason to invest in MERS, obviously, was we were concerned about coronaviruses, because historically we know coronaviruses can be as infectious as the common cold, and they can be as lethal as MERS, which has a 35% fatality rate. We'd never seen the two qualities combined until COVID emerged. And you're exactly right. CEPI was created to be able to respond rapidly to new threats.
Yeah, we're all kind of becoming amateur virologists here, but as you talk about the protein on the surface, everyone has seen these images of a coronavirus with all those spikes, right? And you're referring to one of those spikes effectively, right? And inserting that and allowing the body to develop antibodies to it, which is a very different approach, as you say, from the trials that are happening in China now that are the more traditional attenuated virus. But we've never done this before, right? I mean, this is truly new. So, I mean, we're banking a lot. It seems like CEPI is banking a lot on technology that is very new, that hasn't really scaled up in the past, other than maybe an animal for animals. So how do you see that? How should we think of this as a flyer, as very risky, as very unlikely, or are one of these four going to be pretty likely to make it? How do you look at it?
Well, so we have tried to diversify our portfolio and to hedge our risk in multiple dimensions. Our goals in establishing the portfolio were three. We wanted to achieve speed. We wanted vaccines fast. We wanted vaccines that could be scaled, so scale, because we are going to need to vaccinate billions of people at this point. And we wanted to ensure access. Access is a critically important part of CEPI's mission. And so we wanted a globally distributed manufacturing of these vaccines. So the portfolio that we put together has a diversity of approaches. We have mRNA, DNA, viral vectored vaccines, recombinant vaccines, protein-based vaccines. So we've spread our bets in terms of the approach. We've got 3 of our partners in the US, 3 in Europe, and 3 in the Asia Pacific region. We've spread the bets globally, and it is the fastest that we have ever developed a vaccine in history. But we have had a set of prior experiences where we have exercised at least part of the mechanisms for doing this and for delivering and for distributing vaccines. And so we had the experience with H1N1, the swine flu in 2009 in the pandemic. That recapitulated some of the challenges, not all by any means. We had the experience with Ebola where we had a candidate vaccine, but we had to deploy it into difficult environments and to do clinical trials very, very rapidly to move it through the clinical trial process in an accelerated way. And then we had Zika a few years later where we had a brand new pathogen. It was an old pathogen, but we didn't know much about it. And so we were learning about the pathogen while we were trying to develop the vaccine and while it was spreading across the Western Hemisphere. So I think what COVID-19 does is it brings together all of the dimensions of challenge that we've had in these prior outbreaks into one single gigantic global challenge.
And people are rising up to that challenge. I think there's more than 100 vaccines under development around the world. You're invested in 9 of them, as you say, and some of the more, some of the newer models, some of the newer platforms, and then the ones that have the potential for scale. You just talked about billions of doses. I mean, give us a sense of comparison. Is there any other, type of vaccine that we've seen in modern times where we tried to rapidly develop it and get to billions of doses this quickly? How do you expect that to play out? Are we going to have, 4 or 5 different vaccines that are effective? And so when you say billions of doses, these are spread, different countries are endorsing different ones and they all work in their own way and they're being developed and sent around the world. How do you think it kind of lays out?
Yeah, so I think the closest near analogy, and it's not a perfect analogy, was the effort to scale up the pandemic influenza vaccine in 2009, and we did scale up globally to at least hundreds of millions of doses. I don't know what the final annual capacity was, but we ran into huge challenges in 2009 that are worth talking about as it relates to access. But to just come back to the core question, we are, I think, in undertaking to build a portfolio of the 9 vaccines, and we're looking to expand that. We have an open call for proposals right now, and we want to. They're actually, CEPI has been tracking the global portfolio. It's now actually up to, we think, somewhere between 225 and 260 vaccines under some kind of development. Now, a lot of that's early, not all of it's well funded, but that's a lot of vaccine candidates, and it does represent this incredible reorientation of the entire global scientific community towards this problem. And the information sharing in the scientific community has generally been terrific. I mean, the scientific community has come together, demonstrated solidarity, sharing information, sharing preprints. So that's all a good thing, and that has allowed the rapid evolution of our understanding about the virus. There's still a lot we don't know, but it has also allowed this proliferation of approaches. CEPI has thought that we would need multiple vaccines, and there are a number of reasons to have multiple vaccines. One is that just getting a single vaccine up to the scale that would be necessary, it's really hard to see how you would do that. I mean, some of the candidates, you can see a pathway to 1 billion doses or a bit more than 1 billion doses a year. But, to rapidly generate a number of doses, you're going to need, just arithmetically, you're going to need multiple vaccine candidates trying to scale up to that level. And that'll get you to multiple billions of doses faster.
And is that because of the inputs that are required to make the vaccines? Is it down to that basic fact that we just don't have the manufacturing capability to create that many inputs to then manufacture the vaccine?
It's a couple of things. I mean the inputs are important. When you start a vaccine development project, you don't start at full industrial scale. You start at kind of benchtop level, and then you have to take your process at the benchtop level progressively up to larger and larger scales, and that takes time, and it takes a lot of tweaking, and sometimes you have to loop back and do things again. There is a sub-discipline within the industry of people who know how to do technology transfer, and there's not an infinite number of people who can effectively do technology transfer. And vaccine development processes are very, very specific, require a lot of know-how, a lot of very specific inputs in terms of doing that technology transfer. And you have to sort of do that in sequence. You can't do 10 technology transfers at the same time. There just aren't the people to do it. So it's kind of a bottleneck and a rate limiter. But so you're going to need multiple vaccine candidates, and you probably are going to need different vaccines for different subpopulations. The elderly are at incredibly high risk for this disease, but the elderly also don't respond to all vaccines effectively, and you're probably going to need to use a vaccine with an adjuvant, which is a substance that kind of revs up the immune system and helps strengthen the immune response in the elderly. You may need a different vaccine for pregnant women. You may want a vaccine that has cold chain characteristics that make it easy to deliver into developing countries. And the real concern, CEPI's, very strong concern, and the reason we've invested a tremendous amount of energy focusing on the access problem is that we anticipate that because of weaker healthcare systems, weaker public health systems, lack of access to intensive care, the potential impact of this virus on developing countries in terms of overall morbidity, mortality, and damage to society and to the economy could be much, much greater in developing countries than it will be in developed countries. And we've already seen how bad it can be in developed countries.
And is it fair to say the major factors you have in mind when you use a word like access are cost? You know, how much does this actually cost per dose ultimately? And I know many of the partners you have, including private sector ones, are saying we're not making any profit on this at all, but still there's a cost to manufacture. And then also the cold chain. Are there other factors you're considering? A number of doses, you know, how much training maybe healthcare professionals need to administer, and how are you thinking about that at this point?
You know, I think the access problem in the context of a pandemic, when you're starting with a brand new vaccine, is actually distinct from the access problem for other kinds of medical products. And for other kinds of medical products, probably the greatest rate limiter is cost. You know, if you have a really expensive product and you're trying to sell a really expensive product, then people in poor countries and poor people are not going to have access to that product. In this circumstance, I think the biggest barrier is actually scarcity, which is that we don't have any vaccine right now. And, you know, we've got a number of vaccines that are progressing along, but we don't know which one is going to land first. They're likely not to have a productive capacity initially that will, you know, produce billions of doses from the start. And even if they had a huge annual production capacity, that's still going to take a year to achieve 1 billion doses. And so managing the scarcity of the vaccine in a context that is highly politically charged is the biggest challenge. And so in fact, I think in this case, the biggest challenge to global access and the biggest challenge to equity and to equitable access for developing countries is a phenomenon that I have sometimes referred to as vaccine nationalism. And that's actually a term that seems to have gotten picked up.
It has, it's picked up.
But the idea with vaccine nationalism is that, you know, a minister of health in a country in a developed, wealthy, high-income country is only responsible for the health of the people in that country. And the minister of health, you know, can go out and buy vaccine or can go out on the market and look for vaccine. And if a number of wealthy countries do that and they don't exercise significant restraint about the number of doses that they buy, they can buy up all of that supply because the supply is, you know, the principal characteristic of the supply is that it is constrained. And that's exactly what happened in 2009. We talked about prior experiences. In 2009, there were probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 wealthy countries that many of them had been engaged in pandemic preparedness activities for several years. They had, you know, existing contingency contracts, which they exercised with the global influenza vaccine manufacturers. And suddenly the entire global supply of vaccine in 2009 had been absorbed by a limited number of countries. And in the early fall, we realized what was happening, and we realized that this was going to produce gross inequities. I was actually working in the White House, the Obama White House at the time, and was asked to take on the policy development process around a vaccine donation program. And what had to be balanced in 2009 was the domestically oriented part of the government was, you know, obsessed with getting vaccine for the American public in 2009. And the internationally oriented part of the government, you know, had been engaged in these debates around equitable access and sharing of intellectual property, and was, you know, very concerned that if the U.S. took all of the 250 million doses that we had secured and reserved it all for the U.S. population, that the consequences would be terrible. So, and the thing you got to remember about 2009, and you'll understand how amped up things are now, is the H1N1 virus was about 1/5 the lethality of a normal seasonal flu virus, which means that the current virus is probably 25 to 50 times more lethal than the 2009 virus. And these debates in 2009 were huge, and we considered it a victory, if you will, that we got the government to allocate 10% of the vaccine supply for international use. And so what was created was this international vaccine donation program. And, I think there were 9 countries and 2 private sector partners who donated, potentially up to 200 million doses of vaccine, but only 78 million doses were actually delivered. And none of the doses were delivered until 2010, which was well after the big wave of the pandemic had come and gone. And so it did not achieve very much in terms of equity. And that's the scenario that we desperately want to prevent. And that's actually the scenario that triggered the creation. You probably heard about the Access to COVID-19 Tools, or ACT accelerator, that WHO and a number of countries and us and Gavi and the Global Fund and other organizations have now established to try to achieve equitable access for developing countries from the very beginning, rather than putting them at the back of the queue.
Yeah, I did see that. I did notice that although there are many coalitions that have government partners like CEPI, there are no government sponsors behind ACT at this point, behind ACT. And you mentioned earlier, I just want to make sure I understand well how CEPI is addressing this, because you talk about how governments in that H1N1 example exercise their contingencies that they had in existing contracts to be able to buy up the vaccine. In this case, as you're writing checks to vaccine developers, are you including provisions that say, you have to allow a certain amount of access? Either you have to allow Gavi or ACT as an institution to be able to purchase. Is that a contractual obligation these guys are signing up to?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, there are a number of countries. There's a 10-country facilitation group that is working with the EC and with WHO. And when the EC had a funding event on May 4th, I think there were 34 countries that provided funds that were basically supporting the ACT activity. So there actually is a broad coalition of countries. Our approach to access, so we are in the vaccines pillar working with Gavi and with WHO in the vaccines pillar. At the Global Vaccine Summit, last week, Gavi announced the creation of 2 things, actually, a global COVID-19, a COVID-19 vaccine global access facility, which they're calling the COVAX facility. And then within the COVAX facility for lower and middle income countries, a Gavi advanced market commitment for lower and middle income countries. So when CEPI establishes a new contract, we actually, sometimes are one of several funders for the vaccine development efforts, but we want to make sure that 100% of the vaccines that derive from the CEPI investments, because we're making investments in scaling up manufacturing capacity, are offered to the facility under ACT. And so we're actually channeling potentially a tremendous amount of vaccine into this facility that is committed to achieving equitable access and to making sure that developing countries get vaccine at the same time as the rest of the world.
One of the fears that I've heard is that those contracts, while they exist on paper and they may hold in some circumstances, that governments could kind of Bigfoot this and say, well, if manufacturing is happening within our borders, we're going to take control of that for national security purposes and provide it only to our people. How real is that concern? And is that part of your strategy when you think about manufacturing distribution around the world for these vaccines you're funding?
I think it's a very real concern. We saw instances of that in 2009. I think, the fact that we saw instances in 2009 with a very mild virus, as I said, you can imagine that the pressures to do that will be even greater. So we very deliberately have looked at globally distributing vaccine manufacturing, and we love it when we can do vaccine manufacturing in small countries. In fact, if I could have my vaccine manufacturing facilities in Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, and Vatican City, that would be really cool, right? Because it limits the potential drawdown that a country might impose to protect their local population. And then presumably after you protect the local population, the country would not have any reason to impose export controls. but we have very deliberately chosen our manufacturing sites so that vaccine manufacturing is globally distributed, and we have multiple sites, and we have to be realist about the possibility that a country may be pressured to secure vaccine for its own population before letting any be exported.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to say the fact that you counted over 200 vaccines in development is because the scientific community wants to help in this crisis. And part of me, the cynical parts as well, is it governments who are saying, hey, we better build our own vaccine because we don't know if we're going to get access to these other ones in a timely fashion.
We are not tracking all of the R&D flows globally for COVID vaccines, but we are certainly aware of the major investments in the United States, the major investments in the UK. Germany recently announced a 750 million euro fund to support manufacturing in Germany, and major investments in a number of other high-income countries. So that's a good expression of vaccine nationalism, because we do need very substantial aggregate global investment in these products. And if one country is paying for the research and clinical development of a vaccine, in most respects, that investment can benefit the world ultimately, even if the vaccine, is first manufactured for that particular country. Once that country's needs are met, that vaccine could potentially become available globally. Or even better, if one country's making an investment in the R&D and the clinical development, CEPI can come along and make sure that vaccine can also be manufactured somewhere else, and so benefit like at the same time. And so we've actually undertaken that strategy with a couple of our partners who are receiving national funding elsewhere.
I want to ask you, you mentioned Gavi. Can you explain a little bit how you're working with Gavi? Where does CEPI kind of end and Gavi begin? And what is that working relationship like at this point?
Well, I think there are, let me say, in our pre-COVID roles, CEPI's mission space was more or less defined as developing vaccines, taking them through phase 2 clinical trials, developing investigational stockpiles, and then working with the countries, which again were principally developing countries, where these diseases were likely to emerge, so that they were ready to receive and do clinical trials with vaccines if there was ever an outbreak. And Gavi's role, obviously, is focused on providing funding for the procurement of vaccines and working with other partners to make sure they can be delivered to the Gavi 77. And that, there was daylight between those two organizational missions. We've come together now under the ACT Accelerator and are working through the vaccines pillar in this joint COVAX effort. And between us, we have to fill that space. There can't be any gaps. And so CEPI is leaning into space that we hadn't really leaned into before, which was building up manufacturing capacity, even purchasing raw materials for vaccine manufacturing. And one of the important ideas that has been governing our efforts is to do inventory builds of candidate vaccines even before we have the data to know whether those vaccines are safe and effective, with the idea that while we're building that inventory, we can do the clinical trials. We're not going to cut corners on the clinical trials. Once we know a vaccine is safe and effective, we're in a much better place if we've got tens or hundreds of millions of doses already ready than if we're having to start the manufacturing at that point. So that's all sort of pre-licensure work. And then Gavi obviously is now thinking about how to administer the advanced market commitment and the COVAX facility, and how far it has to reach back into the development phase. And they are envisioning with the COVAX facility and the advanced market commitment, making contingent advance purchase agreements, or CAPAs, CAPAs,
And that's what, contingent on successful clinical trials and regulatory approval?
Exactly. So a company would have a volume guarantee, essentially, even before they had the licensed product. And then if they can deliver a vaccine that meets the target product profile as established by WHO, then the advanced purchase agreement would be triggered. But there are some pieces. I mean, there would probably be some upfront payments and potentially some milestone payments along the way. But then once you demonstrate that you have an effective vaccine, it would trigger the full advanced purchase agreement. And so that's a way that we have coupled. We were talking about the CEPI access piece. The CEPI piece is to make investments that secure potential output for the facility, and the facility can then put in place a contingent advanced purchase agreement. And by doing that, you bridge, this sort of uncovered space, and you create a direct flow from the R&D program into creating output, creating doses, creating capacity, and you have a mechanism that's ready to catch it and buy those doses and then distribute them equitably.
All right, this is very different than the usual chart you see where the timelines are not overlapping, right? You go
right.
phases and phases and phases, and because vaccines are very challenging to develop and very risky and expensive, you do it over this very long period, and now you just compressed everything. You're doing everything at the same time. One of CEPI's roles is to help advance the regulatory process, and I wonder whether you're worried that that could be a sticking point here, that you could advance quickly through the clinical trials, but that you won't get the licenses, the regulatory approvals in time to really move this at the pace you want to.
Well, the regulatory community obviously has been thinking hard about this, and there is a lot of effort among the major international regulators working in collaboration with WHO to think about how will we regulate these products, and how can we minimize the regulatory friction. Obviously, you don't want to have to go to 190 different regulatory agencies one by one, and so there needs to be efforts. A lot of this will depend on WHO's ability to work through the pre-qualification process. And for listeners who aren't familiar with that, pre-qualification allows countries that don't have giant regulators like FDA or EMA to basically draw on the experience of those large regulators, and essentially after WHO validates the regulatory judgment, then many countries are willing to take a product that has been pre-qualified by WHO and begin to use it with a relatively streamlined local regulatory review.
Although you do hear people complain that WHO pre-qualification can be a very slow process. You think that's going to get sped up in this scenario?
I think so. I mean, regulators, in my experience, despite their reputation, perhaps, are among the civil servants who are most ready to adapt to a different risk-benefit calculus, and so they look at a context and they make judgments that take in the risks and the benefits in a given context into account. They're very adaptable, and of course, they want to make sure that we deliver safe and effective products, but they also understand the requirement to do that at the greatest possible speed.
So it looks like, Richard, we are running out of time. It's a great discussion, and we're getting lots of interest in it. I do maybe just one last question, which you somewhat addressed, but we keep hearing this 12 to 18 month time frame, right? And you've gone into detail on all the caveats around that. But so how should we be thinking about the time? Is that the number we should all have in our minds, or should we be thinking in a different way about the time frame for a vaccine?
Well, I think I was asked on a panel, what's my best guess for when vaccine may begin to become more broadly available? And the way the programs are developing, I think the first half of 2021 is still a reasonable guess. Could some vaccine become available before the end of this year? If things go well, I think that's possible, and certainly, they could become available under emergency provisions with some kind of a constrained license, perhaps.
For
But it
healthcare
would be-
workers, for example.
but it would be in small supply, and it would have to be prioritized for those at greatest need. And I think there is global consensus around the idea that the healthcare workers need to be protected first. The story that gets told a lot in vaccinology circles is that the fastest any vaccine has ever been licensed from isolation of the virus to licensure is 4 years. And that was a mumps vaccine that Merck developed. Maurice Hillerman developed that vaccine back in 1963.
Yeah.
Yeah, he actually, it's a great story. He isolated the virus from his daughter, Gerald Lynn. And 4 years later, we had a licensed mumps vaccine. The piece that's not usually told about that story, which I think should encourage us, is that vaccine did not enter clinical trials until 1965. So it was less than 2 years from entering clinical trials to licensure. And I am certain that under the current circumstances, with a global crisis going on, that we can develop a vaccine just as quickly. And we started clinical trials in March. So I'm confident that we will see vaccines in 2021. And if you wanted to pin me down, I would say first half of 2021 is still a good bet, which is about 12 to 18 months from when we first started tackling this virus.
Well, Richard Hatchett, thank you so much. I know everybody watching this is wishing you and your team at CEPI Godspeed as you try to get this vaccine or multiple effective vaccines out to people who need them all over the world. It's really an unprecedented moment. And I'm just so glad you were able to take some time to talk with us. We'll, of course, Devix is on top of the story. We'll continue to talk with you and your team, and please keep us and our community updated.
Raj, it's a real pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.